Hi everyone. This section we want to talk about the date of acquisition. That is where the date of when the acquirer has acquired the other business under the business combination. Right, it's a smaller section, so it won't take long. But this is still another interesting topic to follow here. Right, we say that normally you look at the date when the acquirer has legally transferred the consideration, acquired the assets, and assumed the liabilities, right? But then the acquisition might have actually happened either prior to that date or even later. Okay. I mean, effectively, what are we trying to build here is that so there is a company X, for example, that is looking at acquiring company Y. Okay. So it could be, let's say, 1st of January 21, let's say when it pays towards the acquisition in terms of issuance of shares or transfer of cash, etc. Okay, but then it could also be a case that it is waiting, for example, let's say until 15th of February 21, when, for example, the high court will approve or disapprove this particular merger or the acquisition, right? In any jurisdiction, normally you would see the role of judiciary coming into the picture. Okay, I mean, any entity when it's looking at acquiring another company, right? So high courts, for example, in India, or similar competitive similar authorities, right, would allow or reject, let's say approve or reject the proposed merger or acquisition because of the competitive policies. It should not result into monopoly and stuff like that. So any such mergers or acquisitions are normally approved by the court of law, right? So it can happen that between the company X and company Y, there's an arrangement that yes, you are going to acquire the other business, but of course there's a formality or there is a legal compliance requirement to be done as well. So you need to be looking at the intent or the substance of when that acquisition is actually taking place, right? And that's why it could be important to know what could be an acquisition date, right? From your examination standpoint, you would normally be provided with a clear indication when, especially when it comes to the calculations, right? The date of acquisition would be always known upfront, right? But then, in a concepts, question, right? Then you might be required to test in terms of when do you, for example, acquire the other business. Okay, so when you say that you're looking at the acquisition of acquisition date, it can happen that the acquisition date precedes the date of transfer of the consideration if the agreement provides that the control is transferred, maybe before that date itself. All right, like again, you start looking at when do you see the control being established, right? Again, we talked about it, that the definition of control is covered under Ind AS 110, but predominantly when you look at it, when the acquirer, for example, has commenced the decision making aspects for the other business, the operating and financial policies of that other business is now being looked upon by the acquirer. In case there is a the majority of board members appointment is decided by, for example, the acquirer, and in which the date from which the benefits starts changing the direction in terms of that. Now the very reason why that acquisition was done by the acquirer, they have started reaping the benefits of that. So that could be another outlook to follow, to identify it. And of course you cannot ignore the fact that there could be a need to have a formal confirmation by the high court, for example, or any such competitive authority there, right? You look at, of course, substantive preconditions, then those conditions being met could be a parameter. So there could be some clearances, etc., that need to be done before you are willing to formally acquire the other business. So even those dates could be relevant for consideration, right? Let's have a look at an example here to understand what could be, for example, the acquisition date for us. It says that on 1st of right, on 1st of October 18, the purchase agreement was filed with the Honorable High Court for its approval. Now, subject to the approval, this is important, subject to the approval of the court, the agreement provides that any profits or losses from 1st of April 18 would now belong to Tom Limited. The management of Jerry will run the company from 1st of April as trustees of Tom Limited. Right. The purchase consideration by Tom Limited will be based on Jerry's net assets value on 1st of April and also determined by an independent valuer. Okay. Now, importantly, the High Court approves the transaction on 20th of February 19 and is filed with the ROC immediately. Tom Limited is preparing the consolidated financial statements for the year ended 31st of March 19. The question is, determine the date when the control is assumed to have been transferred to Tom Limited. Now, importantly, in this case, you would want to remember, okay, let me go back to the question there. We are saying that there is 1st of April 18, there is 1st of October 18, and there is, of course, 20th of February 19, and then we have 31st of March 19, right? Now, essentially, the agreement is done on this date, right? This is the agreement wherein, for example, whatever Jerry is, is doing would be now, related to, would now relate to Tom Limited. So in a way, Tom would acquire the business of Jerry, and accordingly, all those profits calculations, etc., the functioning of management, etc., and the valuation basis would be on all dependent on this particular date, right? Now, you may say that this is the date of acquisition, but what you also want to understand is that all these aspects are confined to the approval, right? Approval by the Honorable High Court in this case, right? And essentially, when you look at, of course, the agreement is done, so quite obvious to assume that whatever profits that Jerry makes now will now belong to Tom. Okay, quite obvious to assume that the value of the business of Jerry would be determined on the basis of, let's say, the net assets value as rising on 1st of April, right? And that's independent being done. But essentially, you are, as an acquirer, are you really controlling that business from this particular date? The answer is probably no. Okay, you're not necessarily controlling the business of Jerry, but you are simply expecting, and under good faith, that the management of Jerry will work on behalf of Tom Limited, right? It does not mean that the management of Jerry is working under Tom Limited or they are working at the discretion of Tom Limited. They are still taking the decision making of the business of Jerry Limited, but as a trustee of Tom Limited. But the control, the power, the decision making, etc., is still lying with the same management until 20th of February 19. That is where the moment the approval has happened, that is the time when we say that the control is established and the acquisition date is determined. Okay, of course, it needs to be seen further, and let's talk about the solution. When you look at all these aspects, that the date the control is obtained will depend on a number of factors, whether it is subject to a public offer or a private deal, and subject to approvals, etc. And importantly, the understanding has to be that the offer is unconditional, right? When the offer is in fact conditional, like in the given case, that it is subject to some regulatory approval, it certainly depends on the nature of that approval and where it's a substantive hurdle. Then we may not be able to determine that the control actually has been achieved beforehand, right? However, where the approval is more of a formality, then probably it can be established that the control already exists. Now, in the given case, it is provided that it is all subject to High Court approval, right? If it's all subject to High Court's approval, then the very likely date on which the acquisition is done is the date when that approval from the High Court is obtained, which is of course 20th of February 19 in the given scenario. All right. Let's have a look at another example. It says that Orange Limited acquires 90% stake in Yellow for a cash consideration. So Orange is indeed the acquirer. Okay. The relevant dates are date of shareholder agreement is given at 1st of May. The appointment date as per shareholder agreement is 1st of March. Obtaining the control over the board representation is 1st of June. The payment of consideration is made on 10th of June. Date of transfer of shares to Orange is done on 1st of July 18. The question is, what is the acquisition date, right? Very clearly in this case, we may agree that the date when the control has been established, right? When the control has been transferred to the acquirer, which is Orange Limited, and that is clearly identifiable. That's clearly mentioned in the question, that is 1st of June 18, date of obtaining control over the board representation. Effectively, this date and onward, whatever the acquirer is deciding would be done by, for example, the acquiree, right? So Yellow Limited would only be following the directions of course, the other entity, which simply means that in this case, the control, since it passes on 1st of June, so automatically the date of acquisition in this case becomes, of course, 1st of June itself, right? It does not really matter what is the date of appointment, what is the date of agreement, what is the date of transfer of consideration, or for that matter, transfer of shares as well. Okay. Let's have a look at another example. It says that on 1st of May 18, White Limited acquires Brown Limited in all equity deal, right? So White Limited is the acquirer because it's issuing all shares. Okay. As per the binding agreement, White Limited will get effective control on 1st of May 18. However, the consideration will be paid only when shareholders' approval is received. Okay. The shareholders' meeting is scheduled to happen on 31st of May. If it is not received for issue of shares, then the consideration will be settled in cash. The question is, of course, what is the date of acquisition? Now, importantly, what you want to remember here is the effective control is obtained on 1st of May. So that becomes the acquisition date. Everything else in terms of the manner of consideration or manner of settlement of the consideration would be secondary in the given scenario, right? So it does not matter, right? So by default, the acquisition date is going to be 1st of May. Even if the shareholders don't approve the issue of shares, the payment has to be done. So it doesn't really make any difference whatsoever. All right. So a quick recap, what we discussed, of course, the date of acquisition, generally the date on which the acquirer has transferred the consideration, acquired the assets, assumed the liabilities, would normally be the date. However, you need to also consider the date when the control has been transferred. You would normally give higher regard, higher weightage to the regulatory approval or the court's approval when you are trying to establish that in a practical perspective. All right. Thank you very much.